Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better in two ways. Number one is you can go and leave a brief review on iTunes, or number two is by becoming a patron via patreon.com/SingularityFM. Today, my guest on my show is arguably the most influential living philosopher of our day, which is why Time magazine called him one of the top 100 most influential people in the world. Furthermore, his book on animal liberation started the animal rights movement, arguably, and his textbook on ethics is pretty much the standard philosophy text for first-year students in philosophy across the world, and basically one of my first texts in philosophy when I had to read when I was undergraduate. So, Peter Singer, thank you so very much for joining us on Singularity FM today.
I'm happy to be with you.
Fantastic. So, Peter, I used sort of the standard introduction here that I took from your bio, but if I were to ask you to introduce yourself to a person who has never heard of you before, how would you do that yourself in one or two sentences?
I'm a professor of philosophy working in ethics, and particularly working in practical ethics, that is, the areas of ethics that most connect with our lives. And I'm probably best known for working in two areas. One is about the ethics of how we treat animals, which I argue the way we regard animals is not morally defensible. And secondly, for ethical issues relating to what we in the affluent countries ought to be doing to help people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world.
Fantastic. So, would you say that if I force you to congest that into shorter even, would you say that you're an ethical philosopher? Is that Peter Singer?
Sure. Yes, that's what I do.
Okay, so let's define then what is ethics and what is philosophy.
Okay, well, philosophy is the broader category, so let's start with that. Philosophy is trying to think about some of the deepest problems that we can. And although philosophy used to be very broad and include things like what we now call physics, which was known as natural philosophy, the way the term is used now, anything that you can do experimental science towards is sort of hived off from philosophy. It's separate. So philosophy is the remaining problems that you can't solve by experiments or other kinds of empirical research. Within that area of philosophy, ethics is the area that asks the question, what ought we to do? What is right and what is wrong in our acts? How ought we to live? That's an ancient part of philosophy, a very central part of philosophy. In the Western tradition, it goes back to Socrates and Plato, who asked those questions.
Fantastic. And of course, my blogging name is Socrates, so I have a sort of a tremendous soft spot for the guy. And of course, just for the record, it's not a name I gave myself. It's other people gave that to me many times ago when I was in the army, but that's a whole other story. And just a few questions for fun. I know you're an animal person and an animal lover, but are you a dog?
No, sorry, that's not correct. I'm not an animal lover. I do not describe myself as an animal lover. I have no companion animals, and I'm not particularly interested in having companion animals. And that's an important point, because a lot of people think, oh, well, some people love animals and they think we shouldn't be cruel to them or mistreat them. But I don't particularly love animals, so why shouldn't I eat them? And that's, to me, it's an ethical question. It has nothing to do with whether you love animals or not. Any more than when people were marching for civil rights of African Americans in the South, they were the white racists abused them as nigger lovers, if I may use that word in quotes. And of course, that was an insult, not only that it used that derogatory term, but also that it suggested that if you didn't have some kind of love for African Americans, you wouldn't be marching for their rights. And I think it's exactly the same mistake to think that someone who is concerned about animals and doesn't want to support the cruelties we inflict on them in the modern intensive farming, is therefore has to be an animal lover.
Excellent. And that's exactly the reason why I asked you about this, because I wanted to ask you if you have any pets or any animals. And so you kind of preempted my follow-up question, which is fantastic. Okay, so another interesting personal question I want to ask you is, are you vegetarian or are you vegan?
Well, I'm mostly vegan, but I'm not absolutely strict about that. And it's not to me like a religion that somehow it's a terrible sin if some uh, animal product passes my lips. I, and that's that goes back to something we haven't talked about yet, but that is related to my being an ethical philosopher. My view of ethics is that what we really ought to focus on is the consequences of our actions. Uh, so it's not like a matter of obeying strict rules. It's a matter of saying, what effect am I having on the world? And so I don't eat animals because I don't want to support the abuse of animals, the exploitation of animals that goes into their commercial production. But if it's not easy for me to avoid all animal products, if I'm traveling somewhere and there's not much vegan food around, but there's vegetarian food around, that has some dairy or egg in it. I don't think it's a terrible thing to eat that. So that's why I sometimes call myself a flexible vegan. I'm mostly vegan, but I'm prepared to be flexible about it in circumstances where I think it's not a big deal.
Very interesting. So I'm going to come back later a little bit to that point. Meanwhile, what's your favorite food then?
Oh, I have lots of favorite foods. I'm keen on a whole lot of fruits. I enjoy, getting a wide range of fruits, and of course, we can now get a much wider range, particularly with a lot of ethnic communities that have introduced different tropical fruits and other fruits into diet. But I like food from a range of different cuisines. I like spicy Asian food, like Korean food and Chinese food, and a lot of those dishes can be cooked without meat, using tofu or using eggplants or green vegetables. So there's a lot of that. Some Indian food, of course, has quite a lot of vegan and vegetarian dishes.
Yeah, I watched you on YouTube showing how to cook dal one.
Yes, that's quite an old video now, but yes, I did do that. I know it's still floating around the internet somewhere. Yeah.
Right. The internet never forgets, of course. So, since you've mentioned that you're not like obsessive vegan, but you're mostly vegan with some small exceptions when you travel and stuff, what's your attitude towards? You see, a large part of my audience is transhumanists. And of course, 3D printed meat is one of the things that we have discussed on my show before. So, what's your attitude towards that?
Oh, I think that would be fine if we could produce meat without going through sentient animals. That would avoid the whole problem of the suffering that animal exploitation causes, and it would also greatly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of meat. So it would be beneficial in that way. So yeah, I hope that comes sooner rather than later.
Would you be willing to try that or maybe eat that?
Yeah, sure. I have no problems with that at all. It's not sort of the biochemical substance meat that is the problem. It's the consequences of meat production through whole animals that I'm troubled about. It's similarly, if I sort of came across a deer that had been freshly killed on the road or something like that, I would have no objection to eating that. I mean, I don't particularly want to go and start carving up a deer and so on, but if somebody else were to do it for me uh, and offer me a piece of it, I would have no objection to that. It's again, it's the consequences of what you're doing, what you're supporting, that is really important.
Interesting. Do you own a car?
So I'm talking to you from Australia now, where I spend half of each year, and I do have a car here that we share with our family when we're not around, because in Melbourne it's very hard to get around without it. But when I'm in the United States at Princeton, I don't have a car. It's easier to manage there.
I understand. Who was your greatest mentor or inspiration?
Oh, so in terms of actual personal mentors, I guess I had some teachers of philosophy. One of them at the University of Melbourne is a philosopher not very well known called H.J. McCloskey. And it's interesting because his ethical position was completely different from mine, and rather opposed to the utilitarian view that I follow. But a lot of people don't realize that philosophers appreciate good arguments, whether they share the conclusions or not. And so he was very supportive of my career in philosophy, even though he disagreed with the conclusions that I was coming to. And that was an important influence. Also, then I went to Oxford to do my graduate work, and Professor R.M. Hare was my supervisor there, a very famous philosopher at the time, and he was, I found, an excellent teacher. So those have been mentors. Gosh, there's a lot of other inspirations, I suppose, who go back a lot further. And Socrates could be one of them, in fact, in terms of asking questions, asking awkward questions in society, and probing people about whether they really understand ethics and justice, and those ideas. That's an inspiration.
And being willing to pay the price for
Well,
asking, for daring
yes.
to do so.
I mean, I hope I don't have to face that choice. Let me just say that.
I hope none of us has to. Yeah, of course. What's your greatest ethical failure? Be it personally or as a philosopher, or if you can make that distinction at all.
As I said, one of the issues that I've written at length about is what we ought to be doing to help people in extreme poverty. And I argue that we all ought to be giving significant portions of our income to effective organizations that are making a real difference to the lives of people in extreme poverty. And I do that. I give away about a third of what I earn, but I could give away more. And I think it's a failure in a sense that I don't give away more, that I'm not as purely altruistic as I think ideally I should be.
So you're giving away 30%, and yet you think you can do more than that.
Yes, I can. Now, of course, that's because I'm reasonably comfortably off. I earn quite well. If I was earning much less, then maybe 10% would be all I could manage, if that. But yeah, at my income level, I think I could do better, and I know people who do better. So it's possible. I can't deny that it's possible.
Very interesting. By the way, just out of curiosity, one question to indulge myself. You said that you've actually listened to some of my past podcast episodes, and they were like over 2 hours, which is why you weren't interested originally to come to my show. And I told you I'm going to make an exception for you, of course, and take any time that you're willing to give me. But which ones did you listen to, and what did you think, if you could share that?
I don't really remember exactly which ones I listened to. I was really looking at what you were doing, the kinds of things that you were doing. But yeah, I mean, I think the whole transhumanist sort of issue that you do discuss is really interesting. And I think I tend to agree with the view that we're in some way too committed to our nature as we are. We have this kind of status quo bias to thinking we don't want to change human nature, and yet it's not clear to me why we should think that somehow everything's fine as we are. Obviously there's some risk in change and the unknown, but equally evolution has not produced perfectly desirable beings who get along and create an ideal world. So I'm sympathetic to that perspective.
That's fantastic. And of course, we're going to come back to that, but I just want to put a couple more questions just to sort of give people a taste or a sense of who you are and what you are all about before we get into the serious part of our discussion here in a second. So, what's your biggest dream? What's Peter Singer's biggest dream?
Well, I would like to see a world without suffering, I suppose, or with minimal suffering only, if that could be achieved. And although I don't really expect to see that. There are things that could happen. You've talked already about producing meat through 3D printing or in vitro methods. So if we could really replace meat from sentient animals with other products, plant-based products, or meat that was developed synthetically, either, it doesn't really matter. That would save such an enormous amount of suffering that we're inflicting, and also help to cope with climate change. That would be a dream that I would love to see realized.
So, but how would you know? Let's say somehow it's happening or it happens. How would you know, other than, let's say, the reality of cheap 3D printed meat that would be, let's say, many times cheaper than farmed meat? So that's one fantastic benchmark. What else would have to be present for that dream to be a reality?
Uh, well, that would have to replace the animals who are currently being reared, and so then we would see that those factory farms went out of business. They were sort of just relics standing empty in where they are. That there would then be an immensely amount of grain that would be saved, because it's incredibly wasteful producing grain and feeding it to these animals. So we would have we would have more food, or if we didn't have markets for all of that grain, we would then allow more land to revert to wildlife and to nature. So I think that we would see a dramatic transformation of a lot of the countryside in a positive direction.
Fantastic. And then the flip side of that coin, what's your biggest fear then?
Probably my biggest fear at the moment is climate change, that we are not getting hold of that. We are not reducing our greenhouse gases sufficiently quickly to avoid really grave risk of catastrophic changes to our climate. We're already seeing changes. They're not yet at the catastrophic level, but they're certainly at the worrying level for many people where rainfall patterns are changing, for example, or number of days of extremely high temperatures is increasing. So this is a real worry. I think that this is going to prove too difficult a problem for humans to handle.
You have people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, and even Dr. Stephen Hawking, for example, who have warned that artificial intelligence may actually turn out to be the end of the human race. And that, Elon Musk has called that like summoning the demon. Others have said that it may be the end of the world and stuff like that. How does this kind of fear or concern figure out in your sort of rankings of things we should be concerned about?
Well, to me, it's nowhere near as immediate as the questions of climate change, which I think we need to do something about now. I'm not an expert on AI, but from my reading, we're still quite a long way off of the prospect of AI actually being smart enough to take us over in some way.
Sorry, what do you mean when you say a long way off? Like 50, 100, 200 years or 20 years?
Not 20, somewhere in that 50 to 100 range, perhaps, which I think still gives us time to think about that issue. And let me just say one other thing that's relevant to the values you hear. I mean, we were just saying that the transhumanist perspective says that, human nature is not necessarily perfect or the best form of existence either. So when people say this could mean the end of the human species, if what they're talking about is the replacement of the human species by some form of conscious artificial intelligence that actually can handle the world a lot better than we can, maybe can also be happier than we are and avoid the suffering that we experience, then I'd like to ask the question whether that would be a bad thing. So I would be very concerned if all consciousness ceased to exist and there was no value in the world through conscious beings enjoying their lives and living rich and fulfilling and rewarding lives. But I don't particularly care whether those conscious beings are members of the species Homo sapien, or even whether they're carbon-based life forms. It's it's the consciousness that's important, not the chemistry or the biology.
Would you be concerned, though, about our species' survival or of some kind of continuity between the human species and the let's say, maybe the transhuman species that it may evolve into?
Well, I would be concerned if there was no continuity, I suppose, because
Let me
then the
give you a
various.
hypothetical. Let's say we develop artificial general intelligence and it reads Practical Ethics by Professor Peter Singer and does all kinds of incredible calculations and decides that to maximize the greatest level of happiness and minimize the least amount of suffering on our planet Earth, it has to exterminate the human race. Then are we to?
Yeah, if it got those calculations right, if we're assuming that that was in fact the best thing in the long run for everyone, I find it a little hard to believe that it would be. But hypothetically, we just assume
It's a
it's not
possibility.
completely impossible. I mean, I don't know why, if this is such a super intelligent entity, couldn't find a solution that could say, the human race can continue, but we're going to modify it so that it avoids some of the problems that it's creating.
Well, just like you say in effective altruism that, let's say, $1 spent in Asia or in Africa is a lot better spent because it goes a lot further away than $1 spent, let's say, in Canada or in the United States, they would say, well, if we put all those effort in all those other species, as opposed to the humans, the planet would be much better off because, look, they've run the planet for the last, let's say, a few thousand years, and it's pretty much a disaster. Species extinction, environmental collapse, oceans are acidification, pollution with plastic materials, climate change, you name it, right? The risk of constant nuclear, confrontation between nuclear armed powers. So they haven't done very good job, and it's just not worthy. Let's say effective altruism from the planetary point of view would mean that just like you favor investing in the third world or helping the third world causes rather than, let's say, the people who need it in Canada and in the US, they say likewise only with other species against humanity.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's just assume that that is the case. As I say, I find it not that easy to believe that would be the case. But if it is, then okay. I mean, if they've got the calculations right, and that is the better outcome, as I said, I'm not wedded to the existence of any particular species.
So would you resist any such sort of solution, and would it be ethically wrong to resist?
I think it probably would be ethically wrong to resist it. Yes, I mean, in a sense, you could say it would be natural to resist it, but I don't think we should. Just as if my country were unjustly an unjust aggressor against other countries, and those other countries said, "Look, we have to go to war against your country because you're unjustly attacking other countries and causing a lot of problems in your part of the world." Now, then there would be a strong movement. So let's say it's Australia where I am, strong movement to say, all Australians join the struggle against our enemies, etc. But I think that would be wrong. I think Australians ought to resist that. If they recognise that it's their country that has been the unjust aggressor, they ought not to rally around the Australian flag and defend it. So similarly, I think if in fact this superintelligence correctly judged that we humans are the cause of so much suffering in the world and so much wrongdoing, and need to be exterminated, I think it would be a mistake to say, well, I'm human, so somehow I have to defend all human beings.
So we just walk to the slaughter voluntarily?
If in fact that is the correct solution to all the problems, yes, that's right. As I said, this is hypothetical. I don't believe that would be the case, but if you ask me to assume that it is, then yes, we ought to get rid of ourselves. We ought to take the drugs. Presumably these kind, benevolent superintelligence would offer us some peaceful pill that we can take so that we just gently slip into death and wipe ourselves out, and then I think we should do that.
I've been vegan now for a little over 2 years, and I published an article which kind of was very controversial, and a lot of people got upset at me why I went vegan some time ago. And I gave about half a dozen reasons for being vegan. And about number 5 or 6 was the following argument that, imagine that we have artificial intelligence who is much, much smarter than us and comes up with this thing called not humanism, but AIism, which is based entirely on speciesism, AIism in this case, and favors their own species, and measures everything in rationality or ability to reason. And just like we justify the killing of 70 billion animals and 1 to 3 trillion fish today based on the fact that we're smarter than them, or they're not members of our species or something like that, they do likewise. And so I say that one way to sort of maybe diminish that possibility, in other words, I put forward a claim that one of the last reasons why I went vegan was to create a precedent how a smarter species ought to treat all the other less smart species around it as an end in themselves, not as a means to an end, so that we have a hopefully good precedent, so that when other species are smarter than us, we can hopefully get treated likewise. Do you think that makes sense at all? Would you accept that argument? Is it flawed?
So what I accept is the idea that a useful way of looking at our situation vis-a-vis non-human animals is to imagine that there is an alien, more intelligent species that has power over us and treats us in the way that we treat non-human animals. I think as a kind of a thought experiment, what you're suggesting there is quite illuminating. Do I think that in practice, the fact that we were not treating animals the way we do would make it less likely that this superior species would treat us as we treat animals? Yeah, look, maybe there's something in that. I mean, they might say, oh well, look, they're compassionate to the less rational, less intelligent beings under their power, so they deserve to be treated in the same way by us as they treat other animals.
At least they can't say, look, we do the same that you do to the others.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. So they don't have that excuse for mistreating us, and yeah, that's possible.
Great. Someone criticized me a few weeks ago. Actually, that's happened several times, about the difference between ethics and morality according to them. Would you say that in your view, as an ethical philosopher, there is actually a difference between ethics and morality?
No, I don't think there is, but this is a linguistic question, and I think usage has changed over the past century or more. It used to be that morality was what sort of ordinary people do, what they talk about, to right and wrong, and ethics referred to a more philosophical or scientific reflection on basic principles that might guide our conduct. And you can find that in distinction in 19th century texts, for example, and some early in the first half of the 20th century, maybe too. But I think gradually the meaning of the term ethics has broadened, and people now use it pretty much interchangeably with morality. So I don't think there's much point in trying to draw a difference anymore.
Yeah, and in the beginning of your book, your textbook on practical ethics, you basically say that you're going to use the two terms interchangeably. So basically, as far as you're concerned, they're synonyms. And that's kind of like my position too. So what other are the big issues that humanity is facing today, other than, let's say, climate change, which you say is our top priority, and you didn't think that AI is a top priority? What other would be the top priorities?
Well, I think global poverty is a priority. It's declining, fortunately, but there's still more than 10% of the world's population, about maybe 750 million people living in extreme poverty that the World Bank defines as around $2 a day. That's a very minimal way of living, and obviously there is a lot of hardship that people have to endure. Many things that we can assist them with to get out of poverty and have better lives. And I think that that's a major issue that we ought to be doing something about. So I do see that as a problem. I think there are also potential problems about population growth in some parts of the world, particularly the poorest countries of the world have the highest population growth, and that doesn't seem to be helpful in terms of overcoming poverty. So
yeah, you talk about Nigeria, for example, in your book, and what was the other country you gave as example? Senegal, was it, or what was it?
No, and Niger as well has a very, I think, the fastest growing population or the highest fertility rate, typical number of children born per woman is in Niger, which is an even poorer country than Nigeria, and so that's a worry in terms of helping them to overcome poverty and helping to get out of internal strife. And it's also, Nigeria is likely to be quite subject to climate change because most of it is pretty arid. So, if you have a rapidly growing population and you have areas where food can be grown diminishing, you're going to have a recipe for a really bad situation.
Right. What about existential risks such as, for example, nuclear war, nuclear proliferation, nuclear confrontation? Don't you feel that now with what's been happening, let's say, between Russia and the West in general, I mean, I don't remember personally the situation being as bad for maybe since the collapse of the Iron Curtain, of the Berlin Wall. Are you not concerned about stuff like that?
I am still concerned about the risk of nuclear war. I think I mean, there is certainly some existential risk from that, undoubtedly. If Russia and the United States started using a large number of their nuclear weapons, that could be an existential risk. I think of it more likely as a small number of nuclear weapons could be used, and then there would be a halt rather than total obliteration. But of course, that would itself be disastrous, even if not something that would wipe out our species or life on Earth. So, yeah, I do worry about that. I think there are a number of risks also. I guess there is still risks of pandemics, either natural or instigated by terrorists, for example. But the natural risk is I think significant because there are viruses around that we have no resistance to that are lethal, that at the moment are maybe confined to certain regions, but there's so much more travel nowadays. There's also, again, it relates to intensive agriculture that when you have tens or hundreds of thousands of animals packed together, it's kind of an ideal reservoir for breeding new viruses that could spread to humans. So I think there are risks of that kind that I would see as existential risks that we need to think what we can do about to reduce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just watching on the news yesterday that they're actually just testing a new vaccine against Ebola. It's a Canadian made vaccine, and they're just actually vaccinating the sort of all the medical workers in Africa, where we just had a new outbreak of Ebola, and a nurse just died yesterday. So that's giving me some hope that we're hopefully making progress on things like that. But going back to effective altruism, which is a big part of your life, I know. Let me ask you this, because one of the sort of most kind of the objectivists, I was going to say one of the most powerful, not powerful, but like the objectivist sort of philosophy, if you will, is one of the usual criticism, perhaps, to effective altruism. So I wanted to ask you, what's your take on objectivism in general, and would you qualify Ayn Rand as a philosopher even?
Yeah, so I think it's important when you use this term objectivist to say that you're referring to the philosophy of Ayn Rand because it's a very misleading label. I mean, there are many ethical views which philosophers regard as objectively true, and they have nothing to do with Ayn Rand's egoistic philosophy. So I think for her to take this label objectivist as if somehow that's the only objective philosophy that there is out there is just, like a used car salesman presenting a real lemon as a wonderful car.
It's a good positioning, though. Strategic for marketing purposes, is very smart positioning.
Maybe, maybe for me, yes, exactly. But we ought to beware of those marketing tricks. Um, so I just don't think that that she's really got good arguments going. I mean, Ayn Rand seems to think somehow that if everybody pursues their own interest, that will also be in the best interest of everyone. So she tries to have it both ways, whereas I think if everybody pursues their own interests, especially interests narrowly conceived, as she does, um, that is going to be very far from being the best for everyone. And I think we see that exactly in the situation of climate change, right? In the short term, given that neither you or I are likely to be around by, let's say, 2200, then in the short term, we might say, well, I don't care. I'm going to do whatever I do that has fun, use as much fossil fuel as I like, eat as much meat as I like, and contribute to all those greenhouse gas emissions because the worst consequences are going to come either in the distant future after I'm gone, or they're going to come to the people we were just talking about living in Niger or somewhere like that. And, why should I care about them? Um, but if we all do that, then that is going to be disastrous for people generally in the long run. And I think that to ignore that is unethical. To not give weight to the interests of others who are going to suffer because of your actions is ethically wrong. And as I say, Rand sort of tries to say no, it'll actually be good for everyone, and so she doesn't really see the need to argue for why, if it comes to a choice between my interests and the interest of many others, I should prefer my interests. And I think that's a more difficult argument to make once you recognize that there is this tension or conflict between my interests, at least in some circumstances, and the interests of others.
But what about the argument that egoism is altruism?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. I think that that's just false, right? That would only be true if egoism actually helped others. What is true, but is not actually the way that Rand presents it, is that if you do help others, you're likely to have a better life yourself. That is, there's good psychological evidence that people who are generous and care about others and are connected with others are more satisfied with their own lives, find their lives more fulfilling and rewarding than people who only think about, how much money can I earn, or how can I have a newer car or live in a bigger house. Those things don't provide any kind of lasting satisfaction. But that's, almost the mirror image of what Rand is suggesting, because she glorifies people who do sort of make a lot of money for themselves and claw their way to the top of power.
Right. And I would suggest to our audience that you make a very powerful argument in both your book, The Life You Can Save, as well as Practical Ethics. And I suggest people check both of those out, and it's fantastic. And I agree with you that basically, even if we accept that maybe there is arguably a sort of an optimum strategy in our individual sense, we end up in a global prisoner's dilemma where that personally optimum strategy leads us every time to a suboptimal global equilibrium and the current mess that we find ourselves within, whether with respect to climate change or what have you. But let me move away a little bit from sort of that point of view into the idea, which is another criticism that people often level at me, that ethics is totally subjective. That there's nothing that could ever be objective about ethics. It's always going to remain subjective, and therefore it's useless or besides the point because we're never going to agree upon it. What's your take on that kind of sort of approach or criticism? Is ethics totally subjective?
I have two things to say about that. The first one is that even if it were true that ethics is entirely subjective, it wouldn't follow that we have nothing to say about it, because we might still appeal to other people's subjective beliefs. And for example, if I say to somebody, look, you oughtn't to eat meat because it comes from factory farmed animals who suffer a lot, and they say, well, that's your subjective viewpoint. I don't really care about that. I think I might still be able to say some things to them. I might be able to say, for example, as you did earlier, well, what would you say to superior aliens who treated us the way we treat animals? And maybe that will get them to think about whether they really are comfortable with saying it's okay, they don't care about how we treat animals. Or maybe I just show them some video of animals in factory farms and say, look, you're really prepared to support this? And maybe they'll then realize that their own subjective feelings actually are against supporting that. So it's not true that if ethics is subjective, it's not worth talking about. It still is worth talking about. But the second thing is that although there are certainly respectable philosophers who think that ethics is subjective, and it's difficult to prove that that's not the case, I also think that there are good reasons for thinking that there are objective, self-evident ethical truths. Perhaps the idea that your interests count as much as my interests. If we're sort of similar beings, equally capable of feeling pain or equally capable of enjoying our lives, then for me to think that your pains and pleasures don't matter, but my pains and pleasures do, seems to be unethical. And I think that's something that maybe we can just grasp as a kind of self-evident truth. We may not actually feel it emotionally, and it may not motivate us as it should, but just trying to reflect on it and think about, is there really a reason for thinking that your interests don't matter and mine do? I think we can see that there isn't such a reason.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about that sort of taking the universe point of view as a starting point rather than sort of egoistic, narrow-minded, selfish, single point of view of me and just me, and trying to look at the whole perspective from the universe point of view, and then, or use the veil of ignorance, perhaps even as John Rawls suggested some time ago as a helpful other tool. We touched on transhumanism a little bit, and you said that you're very sympathetic, at least to that degree, that human nature is imperfect, and there's nothing wrong with trying to improve on that. Would you mind unpacking that a little bit more for us? What do you know about transhumanism, and how far would you go in sort of like going along that idea, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've read and thought about some of these issues, particularly in the work of some philosophers who are sympathetic to it, people like Nick Bostrom and Julian Savulescu, who are both philosophers at Oxford, and who talk about enhancement. For instance, Julian has talked about the prospects of moral enhancement of our species, and of the use of various ways of improving our species, both through genetic selection or genetic engineering, but also through possibly, taking some drugs that enable us to think better, or perhaps to even to act more with more concern for others. So I think that those things are worth discussing. I don't shy away from the idea that we might improve our species in that way. And as I said, when you think about, so how is it that we are as we are, the answer clearly is an evolutionary one. And evolution does not have any kind of benign purposes behind it. It's not the guiding hand of providence or anything like that. It's simply the selection of random mutations that are beneficial to the being who survives and reproduces. but the traits that we have developed from our ancestors that were successful for our survival and reproduction are not necessarily desirable traits in the world today. And one example is one that we've already been talking about, and that's climate change. So we have evolved to have certain moral instincts or reactions, and if so you see somebody beating up a small child, perhaps your instinctive reaction is to think that that's a bad thing, and that's because over millions of years, we've evolved as social primates, and it wasn't good for our group for people to beat up children, or they might be our children, so we have this innate reaction against it. On the other hand, it's just as damaging, arguably, in the world today to release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and in the long run will do more harm than beating up a child. But because this is a new problem, we have not evolved any kind of reaction or instinctive repugnance to people who release a lot of greenhouse gases. So we look at some multimillionaire who buys a huge yacht, a ship for themselves, which will produce more greenhouse gases in an hour than a car will in an entire year. And we don't think, oh, that's terrible, this person is doing something awful. We don't have the kind of repugnance that we would if we saw that person beating up a child. But we should. We need to have the kinds of reactions that will enable us to solve the problems of the 21st century, not the problems of 5,000 years ago.
So let's take that idea of or possibility about moral enhancement and enhancement in other ways, step by step here for a second. I have the argument on my show quite often whether intelligence is a good thing in itself, and is it necessarily the case that higher intelligence is likely or guaranteed to be more ethically moral or not?
I would say likely yes, but guaranteed no. And I think I would say likely yes for the reasons that we were talking about ethics, that the more reflective we are, the more we're capable of thinking about our situation. And
is being reflective being intelligent? Because look, my concern is that, let's take, for example, Einstein's experience in Berlin. He lived within sort of the cream of the best scientists in the world of his day, and Berlin was more or less the scientific capital of the world. That's my argument anyway, of course. And in a very short period of time, he was shocked and dismayed and disgusted how all his colleagues basically became nationalistic to the degree that they were able to switch instantaneously working from their own work to, let's say, producing weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons, for example, and did not see that as being unethical in any way possible. And yet those were some of the smartest people of his day. And so my argument is that it's not necessarily the case that ethics or doing the right thing morally coincides necessarily with higher intelligence. In fact, sometimes less intelligent people are perhaps arguably more reflective, as you say.
Yes, that's why I said I think there still is a tendency for more intelligent people to be able to think more calmly and clearly about ethics rather than being dominated by their instinctive emotional responses. But it is only a tendency. And, I think if you look at the situation of Berlin in the 30s, I don't think it was the most intelligent people in Germany who voted for Hitler, who put Hitler into power. I'm not saying that nobody who was intelligent voted for Hitler. I'm sure some did. But I'm pretty sure that if you'd looked at the levels of education and even intelligence among those who voted for Hitler as compared to those who voted for, let's say, the Social Democrats, you would not have found that it was in any way the intellectual elite who were voting for Hitler.
Even some famous philosophers turned out he had very strong Nazi association.
Well, Heidegger did, obviously, but I think a lot of this happened after the Nazis came to power. And so then you get this very powerful kind of groupthink going on. it's really nicely, if you know the Ionesco play, The Rhinoceros, it's really nicely satired there about how some completely crazy idea like turning into a rhinoceros starts to become attractive when you see other people doing it. And I think that he was obviously thinking about the rise of fascism. That it's a kind of a group think once it gets going, and we do have this group tendency. We are herd animals. Again, that's an evolutionary trait that we have, and one that I think it would be really nice to sort of get rid of if we could. It's okay when you go and cheer for your football team, but it's not good when it leads you to embrace fascism because other people are. So I think that's what's going on there. And yes, unfortunately, this is so powerful that it can overcome the judgment of the most intelligent people, and that's really what Einstein was reflecting on. But as I say, would Hitler have got there in the first place if only the better educated, more intelligent people had been voting? I think not.
I don't know. When I watch today things like Brexit and Trump, I don't think it's a division along educational lines or intelligence. I think there are some commonalities.
Yeah, I don't agree though. I think if you look at who voted for Brexit and who voted for Trump, I mean, I think education was a factor. I can't quote you figures, but I think people with tertiary education with degrees were less likely to vote for Trump and less likely to vote for Brexit.
Yes, I accept that completely. But I'm just saying not exclusively, but yes.
No, absolutely, not exclusively. It's only a tendency, yeah.
Okay, so the other way the transhumanists usually talk about enhancement, which is very important for them, for us, I should say, is life extension. So let me ask you this. Is research aimed at extending human life and hopefully eventually defeating death altogether moral, in your opinion, or not?
I think it is. I think it's reasonable to say that it's in people's interests and everyone's interests if they can live longer and perhaps ultimately if they don't die at all. But the qualification is, I did refer to population growth in some parts of the world. The qualification is that if we're going to be around for much longer, then we do have to solve that problem. We do have to make sure that reproduction levels are not so high that we have.
But I think that's not really a problem, though, because if you look at the longest living countries in the world today, places like Japan, all of them have negative growth population-wise. So it seems to me there's a strong correlation, and as you pointed out, the highest growing countries are countries with very high death rates and very short lifespans, by the way. So it seems to me there's a very strong correlation that as soon as we get a society to the point where they're able to live, let's say, to 80, 90, and 100, then the population growth kind of naturally tapers out.
Well, there's a correlation, but I don't think it's causation. I think there's a common factor,
yes.
Both in longevity and in lower population growth. So if we were somehow to get the greater longevity without those other factors, maybe that wouldn't happen. But you may be right that it's likely that they'll come together, and if so, then if that will sort of automatically solve the problem, then it would be a good thing without possible hazard that I was referring to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting. And going back sort of to the AI question and the technological singularity question, because after all, my show is called Singularity FM. Ray Kurzweil, by the way, and the majority of people think much closer timelines than you have given. So Ray has gone on the record to say that 2028 will be when machines would match human intelligence, and then by 2045, we would have the technological singularity. Sort of the average opinion in, let's say, computer scientists and people in the field, with a few polls that I have seen with a couple hundred experts, have generally started to shift within 2 or 3 decades from now. And already even some of them are actually saying that Ray is kind of being conservative given the most recent developments that we have observed with, let's say, DeepMind and AlphaGo and things like that. So would you not use that as evidence to perhaps reconsider why Elon Musk and all those other people I mentioned have urgency on their end as much as, let's say, climate change, perhaps? Nick Bostrom, who is another colleague of yours, he is buying that argument, it seems.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know I've seen these surveys, but I've asked people, for example, at Princeton University, the Center for Human Values that I'm involved with has a kind of joint program with the Center for Information Technology Policy. And we had a workshop last year where we had people from DeepMind as well as from Microsoft and Facebook and Google talking about various issues, ethical issues raised by AI. And at some point, I think I said, well, look, there's nothing on the program here about the singularity or about, AI takeover. And why is that? And basically, they laughed. They said, we don't see this as anywhere near on the horizon. And, the people from DeepMind were saying, look, yes, winning at AlphaGo is one thing, but it's a very clearly defined game operation with very specific rules. And it's nothing like the kind of intelligence that you would need to actually be able to sort of function in the world in the way that humans do, or even in a superior way to that. So I don't know. As I say, I'm not an expert on this, and maybe I should just accept my uncertainty and therefore say, if this is a risk, we should be taking it seriously, and maybe it will come faster than I think. I don't know. I accept my lack of real knowledge on this. I'm just reporting what other people have said.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, time is advancing, unfortunately, and we have maybe 3 or 4 minutes to wrap our conversation up. So let me just ask you a couple of questions here, quickly, perhaps. So my whole kind of presumption or premise of my blog and my work for the last 10 years is the claim that I've put forward to say that technology is not enough, that we need ethics. Then I have people like Lawrence Krauss, who basically I interviewed on my show a couple of months ago, who told me, no, ethics is useless. There's no ethics in physics today. There's no ethics in cosmology. It's not even needed to be in the committee. There's no use for it. I have a friend who is an engineer who tells me, you philosophers are all bullshitters because after the end of my day, I have something to show for it. You guys have nothing to show for it at the end of your day. So how do I convince people? What's the approach that I should take to tell people? And am I correct at all in putting forward the claim that technology, and especially our civilization at the crossroads that it is at right now, could really benefit from ethics?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right, and I think in fact it's obvious when you stop and think about it. Technology doesn't tell us what to do with the discoveries, right? This person may say, so at the end of the day, I've got something. Let's say I've produced some new technological device that can do something that we couldn't do before. But we still have to ask, well, is it good? Do we want to do something with that, right? What is your device? Is your device something that is going to, inflict horrible pain and suffering all over the world? Or is it something that is going to make people happier? It's an ethical question that says if it's going to inflict pain and suffering all over the world, we don't want it. Thank you very much. If it's going to make people happier, well, maybe we do want it. That's ethics. And people like Larry Krauss, who I know, and actually it's a bit funny that he says that because he's invited me to Arizona to, you can find a conversation we had on YouTube.
I watched it, yeah.
Right, yeah. So, so I think he's really aware of this. And what he's really saying is, well, it's kind of obvious that we know that making people happier is good and, making people suffer is bad.
But it has no direct bearing, he claims, to physics.
Well, I mean, it has no direct bearing to understanding the origins of the universe, let's say, to cosmology. Okay, that may be true, I'm not, but even the question, is it worth spending resources on doing cosmology, is an ethical question.
Exactly.
So it's in that sense, cosmology, it doesn't help us to understand the origins of the universe, but cosmology has to be wrapped in a framework of ethics to tell us whether it's worth doing at all or not.
Very much so. I actually wrote an article called Technology is the How, Not the Why or What, which basically argues that kind of argument. But we really in the last couple of minutes here. So one quick audience questions and then two quick ones to wrap it up. Cynthia Stewart is asking, what is the most effective method for individuals advocating local and global veganism?
I think try to be reasonable about it. Don't be too hardline. Don't be too fanatical. Don't be too self-righteous. Present it as a great way to live, as a way that makes you feel good in yourself because you know you're not making the world worse, good in terms of exploring different ways of eating, good in terms of what it does to your body. Take a positive view of it, I think, is the best way to present it, to persuade people to.
And I would have to say, after watching probably 12 or 15 hours of your speeches and presentations, one thing that comes across very clearly is how you can be so good at not coming across as preachy in any way, but humble and very kind of open-minded. And that's, I think, amazing, and it works very well with people, because just a couple of years ago, I was on the other side. And you were one of the people who, by the way, tipped me over into the sort of the whole vegan thing. And it's been the best thing I've ever done for myself, for the climate, and for the animals, I think, personally speaking. So I'm grateful to you for that. But where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, I have a website called petersinger.info that has some information. Part of my work, as I said, is related to extreme poverty, and I've founded an organization called The Life You Can Save that is about that. So you can go to thelifeyoucansave.org and find out more about that there. And there are a lot of books you can find on my website on petersinger.info. You can find my CV, which has a lot of books. So you've mentioned some of them. The Life You Can Save is one. The Most Good You Can Do is another.
Animal Liberation is another part.
Animal Liberation is, I think the first really important book that I wrote, and fortunately has been in print ever since it was first published and revised editions. So I hope people will pick up that. I've just written a very short introduction to utilitarianism together with a Polish colleague. So it's called Utilitarianism, a very short introduction in the Oxford University Press series. So if you want to know more about my underlying philosophical outlook, that's a good place to pick up too.
Yeah, and I would have to say I really recommend your practical ethics, because I think they are really practical. That's the key word. Because people, when I talk to people, they think ethics is this thing that's useless for them. And my argument is always, it's ethics done proper is the most practical thing you can have. Is think that you can start applying today in your daily life right now, and it can change it for the better tremendously. But Peter, we've been talking for about 60 minutes today. So if I were to ask you to wrap up our conversation in a single most important message that you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from this conversation with you today, what would you like that to be?
Well, let's go back to Socrates, since that's the name you used, right? I mean, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. What we've been doing is trying to examine our lives and try encourage others to examine their lives and to think about the ultimate values that they want to live by.
Peter Singer, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.